So it's my very, very great pleasure to introduce to you a guest speaker to a section whom I'll be interviewing. So Professor Nathan Abrams, who teaches a film in the Media Studies Department, which I suppose is part of the School of Languages, Literatures, Linguistics, Media. So some of you might already know Nathan from other modules elsewhere in your degrees. There's far too many things that Nathan has done to give a comprehensive introduction, and I actually do want to have time to cover the film, but Nathan has extensively written about cinema, specifically also about representations of Jewishness and Judaism in contemporary cinema, and recently published the book Stanley Kubrick, New York Jewish Intellectual. I'm worried that I got the title wrong. No, I think I got it right. And so this is just a little snapshot of the kinds of things that Nathan has done and that qualify him obviously eminently more than me to talk about The Shining. So we thought we would give you this opportunity to have that perspective, and we do it in the format of an interview, so you can hear a different voice this week as well, because I think you've really been kind of tortured by just listening to me. So thank you very much for being here, Nathan. And I'll get started with our first question. So can you just tell us a little bit about how Kubrick came to make The Shining? And where the film fits in Kubrick's career and work more broadly.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. It's interesting to see how another lecturer deals with Blackboard and lack of student interaction. I think you're more of a rager.
I think we've lost Nathan, haven't we? At least temporarily. I'm sure he'll be back in a second. This is the problem with Blackboard. See, you kind of have all the best intentions, and as soon as you start speaking, everything kind of collapses, and you don't have a chance. But anyway, I'm sure Nathan will be back in a second. I can see that he's reconnecting right now, and yeah, that's just my woe with Blackboard all semester as well. Suppose when it happens to you as students, you can like relatively easily hide kind of because there are others, but when it happens to you as an instructor, it's just the most awkward thing in the world. So let's hope we get Nathan back. I'm glad we started a little bit early, so we're not losing out on too much time. I'm sure he'll be back in a minute. Thought it was my internet first because it's been playing up a little bit recently as well, but then I could see that around, but I can see that Nathan is joining us again now. There's a classic Blackboard collaborate. Welcome back, Nathan.
Sorry, literally it never happened. Never happened in all my Blackboard sessions. It's never happened when I'm leading. Yeah, anyway, so I'm back now. Where did you lose me? Did I say anything?
We lost you when you were talking about kind of just dealing with Blackboard and radio presenting, okay. And then you were out. It was actually kind of amazing how quickly that went. But yeah, right. Sorry about that.
No, that's probably my internet's fault. Okay, well, all right. So Kubrick was born in 1928, and he started off as a photographer, which not many people know. And then in 1951, he made his first documentary, and he made 3 documentaries. And also made a fiction, a feature film called Fear and Desire, and that came out in 1953. And I'm trying to count. So I'll just list his films because that's the easiest way for me to remember them. So and then he followed up with Killer's Kiss and then The Killing. They're 2 films noir, crime dramas. One boxing and one a heist. And then he did Paths of Glory, which is a First World War film. Then he did Spartacus, which is a biblical epic. Then Lita, an adaptation of the controversial novel, which might appear somewhere on your English syllabus at some point, or not, I don't know, but something to think about. And then he did Doctor Strangelove, which was a kind of black comedy about nuclear war. He said it was the only way to treat the subject. Then in 1968, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which has just about influenced every science fiction movie since. And then Clockwork Orange, again, another piece of literature. Well, we can talk about that, actually. Kubrick loved adapting literature. 75, Barry Lyndon, also an adaptation. I think more your period, Thackeray. Karen, and you probably know more than I do. I'm sure you do. And then, so 75 was his film, and then he was looking around for another project. And 77, the proofs of The Shining were showed to him, or The Shine, I think it was then called. And Kubrick jumped on it immediately and made it very quickly. So between 77 and 79, he made the film, and it was released in 1980. So there you go. There's a quick run through of his career.
Well, I couldn't have done that without Wikipedia, so that was that's amazing. I don't think I could even do that with the authors I'm kind of supposedly an expert on. I always have to go back and check the dates. But yeah, so as you mentioned there, Kubrick is quite interested in adapting works of literature. As you mentioned Lolita, you mentioned Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon. There's obviously also a huge range, and then adapting something that's very, very contemporary to him in the Stephen King novel, which he does very quickly. So can you tell us a bit about how Kubrick approached literature adaptation generally, but also specifically with the King text, with The Shining or The Shine, or whatever the title was at the time?
Karen, you make a good point there. So one of the things, just to say, so I never used to teach film studies full time until I came to Bangor, and when I was given the job back in 2005, 2006, they asked me to put a new module, and I thought I'd do Kubrick because we don't tend to teach authors, as it were, auteurs in film studies. I mean, Steve Price did with Hitchcock. We tend to teach genres. And one of the reasons I chose Kubrick was by that point he'd done 12 films, or he'd done 13, but one wasn't available. And you could fit that into a semester because 2 of them are short, and they cover almost every genre. So I wanted to say that because that fits into what something you just said, Karen. And by the way, I think we've agreed that English students can take my Kubrick module next year. So if do consider it. It's loads of it's loads of literary. If you're interested in literature adaptation, screenwriting, as well as filmmaking, we discuss all of that. So he covered every genre, and his previous film was a historical drama. Barry Lyndon. It was kind of to compensate for the failure to make Napoleon. And then he came across The Shining, and I think one of the reasons he wanted to make The Shining, I don't anticipate too much of what you're going to ask me later, was if you think since 1967, it's what we call new horror. So prior to 1967, I saw you did Frankenstein. If you think of the old Frankenstein, right, the 19... See, this one I do need Wikipedia. The 19... something. When is it? When was it?
31, I think. And we did the 1935 Bride. But yes.
Yeah. But if you think of all those original ones back in like the 30s, you think of all the Universal horrors. There was always some kind of evil externalizing a creature, so Frankenstein or a werewolf or Bride of Frankenstein or Dracula. So I think that was 31 as well. I was taught that. That's one I've taught. By 67, you've got this new horror, and it starts with Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, where suddenly evil isn't like externalizing a monster anymore. I said, and my point is, if you've got a monster that's evil, you kill the monster, kind of the evil disappears. Here, it's like not really in anything. It's in people, everyday people. So Rosemary's Baby, the kind of genius of that is that we don't know whether the protagonist, who's a pregnant woman played by Mia Farrow, is imagining it or not. And so everything she has she gives a kind of supernatural explanation for could have a psychological one. And then the people who are meant to be evil are just a bumbling, klutzy couple next door. So, if they are evil, they're also kind of evil in the banal sense of evil that Hannah Arendt sort of suggested. I won't get too much into that, but Kubrick had read that. So we then have, if you think movies like The Exorcist and The Omen, and then through the 70s, and then 1980, Kubrick wants to make a movie that kind of is the horror movie, the scariest horror movie that encapsulates everything that's happened since then. So there's all that film background, and so that's one thing that Kubrick does is he's always situating his movies in other movies. I mean, that's what filmmakers do, is they make loads of references. Probably the same in literature. I'm just not as knowledgeable about that. So that's his first thing. But secondly, he does loads of research. When Kubrick researches his movies as if like he was writing a thesis. But generally his approach is he always adapts from an existing source, right? Not since his first two films did he write original screenplays. He knew he wasn't a writer, and he always worked with people. His earliest collaborator was Howard Sackler, who worked on Jaws and The Graduate. So you might not have heard of him, but you might have heard of those movies. But from The Killing onwards, he always used a pre-existing source, and by and large, he always used fiction. Apart from the Napoleon Project, which he never did, would have been based on non-fiction, but not a pre-existing source. Barry Lyndon was based on Thackeray, Lolita was based on Lolita, and 2001 was based on some Clarke short stories, Clockwork Orange. The Shining, he read The Shining and he was like, right, I can adapt this. And the person he approached to do it was an author called Diane Johnson, and she was a professor at Berkeley in California who was an expert on Gothic, so she'd be perfect sort of like case study for this, who'd written her own novel called The Shadow Knows. And Kubrick really liked it, but didn't feel it was right for adapting. I suspect, right, and this is just a suspicion, is Kubrick didn't feel comfortable adapting a book with a female protagonist. There's lots of questions around Kubrick and feminism, but that's something we can discuss if you're interested. But he chose The Shining as this male protagonist at its heart, but he worked with Diane Johnson very closely in adapting it. I don't know what people have heard about Kubrick. There's a lot of myths out there, many of which aren't true. But he wasn't this dictatorial sort of ogre that he's made out to be. I'm sure he was difficult to work for. Let's not, he was a demanding, exacting director who had no respect for the clock. But this wasn't aimed at any group in particular. Just anyone who worked with him, he expected them to devote all their attention and energy to it as he was. So he could be an unreasonable employer, but he was unreasonable to everybody. But he also listened a lot to other people. So this wasn't a one-way collaboration of him telling Diane Johnson what to do. She would have given him as many ideas and it would have been back and forth. I just correct a few misconceptions about him there. Obviously, I could talk for hours about this, so I'm trying to, because I know you got future questions, so I'll try.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful, and I think I haven't kind of quite realised how much of an adapter Kubrick actually was, and I think I was aware of the kind of obvious ones, but then, for example, 2001: Space Odyssey, I had no idea that had a kind of literary source as well, which of course makes him a kind of perfect director to be looking at in the context of a sort of primarily literary module. So that's absolutely brilliant. And I mean, as I understand it, sorry, this is kind of slightly off-piste from the questions I gave you, but as I understand it, Stephen King was quite unimpressed with the adaptation initially. Is that right, or am I just imagining that?
No, you're 100% right. I mean, for Kubrick, I mean, this also answers your previous question. For Kubrick, the source text was a blueprint. It's interesting because one of my former PhD students, he's got his PhD, has been Facebooking me saying, for Kubrick, the screenplay was, he didn't do a PhD on Kubrick, otherwise I'd have to tell him off, but he said, oh, I thought he never deviated from the screenplay. I go, well, actually, no, for him it was a blueprint. So the novel was a blueprint, he adapted it, he and Johnson adapted it, and then they went into a movie with a working blueprint that then changed, right, as they were shooting, because his ideas were not made up like Hitchcock. If anyone, unfortunately we won't be able to do it next year. Hitchcock's ideas were made up before he started shooting, whereas Kubrick was really open to changing things because he only cared how it looked on camera. So you can have an idea, but before you look through the viewfinder, if it doesn't look right, you're not doing it. So there's a little excerpt from the Making the Shining, the documentary his daughter shot. I will answer your question. And his parents are visiting the set, and they're joking with Jack Nicholson about what are all the coloured pages for, and they said, well, it represents all the different changes and which day, and Jack Nicholson's like, you know what, I don't even bother read the script anymore, I just read the page I'm given that day. It was changing that often. And now obviously, so if you think you've got King's novels starting here and it goes through this process of adaptation, by the time it gets to the shooting, it's changed loads. And as much about what's possible, that's good on camera, as anything else. So yeah, King's famously said something like, you can Google the exact words, it was like a big beautiful Cadillac with the engine taken out. But you know, when he tried to adapt it himself, people think that's even worse. But I suppose it depends where you stand on King, right? If I had to come down on one side, I'm more Kubrick than King. I'm not a fan of King. I've read him, but yeah, I'm biased. I prefer how Kubrick makes films than King writes books.
That's really interesting, and I suppose just a really helpful point for literature students to remember as well when they're writing about adaptations of films and when they're writing about film, that it's adapted for a different medium. Like what you're saying there repeatedly, like it's what looks good on camera or what works well on camera. So I suppose I asked you for whether you have any kind of tips for literature students or for students generally in writing on adaptation, and I suppose like maybe one of them is to kind of pay attention to what is the film doing and what's kind of the medium doing. We've thought about that a little bit in relation to Bride Frankenstein as well, but I don't know whether you have any other things you'd...
Yeah, I mean, all right, yeah, sorry, cut you off there now. Yeah, the one tip that Kubrick learned was never work with the adapter of the source material. He tried that with Lolita and it didn't work. The quip they said was when Vladimir Nabokov delivered his draft, they said you couldn't lift it, let alone film it, because it was so long. By the way, just out of interest, if you're interested in adaptation of I don't know if anyone's studying Lolita at all in the 3 years, if it's on anyone's syllabus. There's a fantastic podcast called the Lolita Podcast that explores all the adaptations across loads of genres in real detail. I recommend that. I'm always recommending podcasts to my students, but it looks at across the two films and as well as music and theatre. Anyway, back to topic. He never worked with a writer again. I think he wanted a different perspective. And again, I think what you need to think of as adaptation is it's not about fidelity. People get too hung up on that. You're trying to capture something from the novel, whatever got the filmmaker's interest in the first place, but it's your own piece of work. And also, for those budding screenwriters, when you write a screenplay, you're just dealing with words, text, and a film moves and sounds. And you can throw in all the illusions, the music you want. Burgess did it loads in Clockwork Orange. But it's not the same as when you've got to score and set up the scene for a movie. So you need to think about all those things as well. So I wouldn't, I've never tried it. But what Kubrick did was he would take a novel and break it down into what he called non-submersible units. He said every novel has units that you can't get rid of, and he'd try and break it down into those and build the film around like a dozen of those, because obviously you can't do everything. And interestingly, the two he adapted on his own were Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon, because he said, well, these are already like films. I can see the adaptation without needing to work with someone. But he obviously couldn't see it with The Shining, so he worked with Diane Johnson, and then they would have broken it down into these non-submersible units and then built the film around that.
That's really interesting because we were talking about Edgar Allan Poe just before reading week, who always had this idea of unity of effect and kind of building things around kind of core blocks. So I suppose there's almost a kind of an interesting parallel there between what Poe did with poems or stories and what Kubrick seems to be doing when he's adapting text. But that's just a total me rambling by the by. And you're here to kind of stop me from rambling today to students.
No,
yeah, really interesting.
Well, Kubrick was a big fan of Poe. You can see a Poe. See, the interesting thing is, right, we could turn everything you're studying and make it relevant to Kubrick. I was looking through your Blackboard site before just to see how other people do, but you know, Frankenstein, the myth of Frankenstein, I think, has informed a lot of Kubrick's work. Poe certainly, and there's explicit references in Lolita, and the passcode that saves in Doctor Strangelove is an anagram of Poe. You know, peace on earth ends up being OPE. So there's definitely this like influence there through to his final film, in Eyes Wide Shut. So there's Kubrick. He wasn't such a big reader in school, but he became a reader as he got older, and he audited classes at Columbia taught by some of the greats like Lionel Trilling, and I think definitely that literary, or at least literary pretension, should I say, influenced him, and he stuck in these references. And working with people who were writers, no doubt they knew this stuff, so they put it in as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting and a nice aside. And I mean, I'm really actually glad that we added this film. I mean, I know that there's plenty of opportunities to study Kubrick anyway at Bangor, but we didn't used to do The Shining on the module until last year. And then last year, because of the strike, it didn't happen. So it's actually the first time of doing it properly. But I'm kind of really glad to see how it slots in with everything else. And yeah, because so you already mentioned that Kubrick was a big researcher and read a lot and read very voraciously, and I think you mentioned that he read Hannah Arendt earlier on, which I was also not aware of, but I think if I remember right, you mentioned that he also read some Freud, not today, but when we discussed previously. And so on the module we've been looking at Freud's essay The Uncanny, and it kind of underpins a lot of how we look at literary text, especially since week 4. So I'm wondering, yeah, in what way Kubrick read Freud and responded to Freud, whether Freud's theories, particularly his kind of psychoanalytic theories, mattered to Kubrick in his filmmaking, or particularly, especially with the Shining, I suppose.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, Kubrick was a big fan of Freud from a young age, and was always trying to convince his friends to read it. And remember, I mean, I don't know how much context you're doing. See, before I came here, I taught American history, so I'm interested. So I try and situate the films in the historical context. The 40s and 50s psychoanalysis was very popular in the United States, and sort of everyone's undergoing analysis amongst the intellectual circle that Kubrick would have liked to think he's a part of. So you know, this is really kind of the age of Freud in the United States. And Kubrick himself was a fan of Freud and read Freud and Freud's contemporaries like Arthur Schnitzler, who was considered Freud's doppelganger. Freud famously wrote this letter saying, I've resisted meeting you for fear when you meet your doppelganger you'll die. So this idea of doubles runs throughout Kubrick's work. There's loads of Freudianism in terms of Oedipus, well, not Oedipus so much, I think more relationships with the father. That's what I've written about, is how Kubrick's films reflect, as Freud's work reflected on the father's hatred and envy of the son, and the sort of attempt to kill him, as reflected in Genesis 22, which is when Abraham tried to bind Isaac. So by the time we get to The Shining, so we can see all this Freudian sort of themes running through his work, doubles, mirrors, etc., fathers, and then we get to The Shining, and this is probably Kubrick's most explicitly Freudian text, not least because he reads The Uncanny with Diane Johnson, and they put these references to it in the movie. So this idea, when Jack says it's very homey, it's like I've been here before, like I knew what's around every corner. I mean, I've got theories about that, but so this text I think is explicitly Freudian. When I wrote about this for my book, what I suggested is this is an auto case history in a Freudian mode, where at that point Kubrick is reflecting on himself through the character of Jack. And there's a kind of lot of collapsing between himself and the character of Jack in the way that Jack Nicholson plays him, and just in the character type. So yeah, I think this is most Freudian text, and the one in which the uncanny explicitly underpins it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and definitely feels like an extremely uncanny text. And I mean, it was interesting that kind of a reverse Oedipus there, the father kind of hating the son, or being in competition with the son. So I'm gonna have to think about that more. So I suppose you mentioned earlier the kind of shift to new horror and the influence of something like Polanski, Rosemary's Baby, and the sense that evil is kind of no longer externalized or put into kind of clearly defined figure that can be defeated. And I suppose that's very, very true for The Shining to an extent. And particularly maybe in these family dynamics we see, but at the same time we do have these ghosts that seem to kind of wreak havoc to a certain extent. There's the kind of supernatural element, and I think if I'm not mistaken, there has been quite a lot of discussion and critical debate and popular debate about how to interpret those supernatural elements, and particularly the ghosts, particularly Danny's gift and Dick's gift of The Shining. How do you read these elements? Not to kind of explain the film away or take the kind of pleasure of interpretation away, but just sort of what work do you think they do in the film?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the adaptation is that Kubrick emphasized the psychological over the supernatural, and I think especially, well, there's two versions. There's a US version and a European version. The European version is much less ghostly than the US version. And the novel had things like this, the hose that comes alive, and the topiary animals, and the bee's nest. And Kubrick got rid of those mainly because, like, in 1979, special effects weren't what they are now. But whatever reason he did it for, at least what we see in the final film, it's far more psychological. So the only single bit I'd say that defies any explanation is how Jack gets out of the larder. But maybe he convinces Shelley Duvall, Wendy, to do it. Maybe. So that's the only bit. Other than that, I think everything else can be held to a rational explanation, other than maybe a little bit ESP between the characters. But to me, the ghosts aren't as evident as probably King would have liked them to be. So that's how I would read it, is that everything else can be explained away, right? Jack Shiny's imagining all this based on research that he's doing into the hotel's history, which we know he's doing from the novel, but it isn't explicit in the film. So that's how I'd read that.
Because you mentioned earlier that you have a theory about, or a speculation about, where the sense of having been there before, Jack's sense of kind of being familiar with the place, comes from. So if you don't mind me asking, what is your theory about that? Because it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think we're meant to take any of this literarily in a literary fashion. So if we go back to the opening shot of the movie, like whenever I do a presentation, I always start with this, right? I show people the whole 3 minutes, and I go, well, tell me what you've seen. Why do you think? If you think the first 3 minutes of a movie are probably some of the most important in conveying information to you, right? Why does he spend 3 minutes showing this tiny little car driving up a mountain to a hotel? Well, one, it's to show its isolation, okay, clearly, and its scene setting. But secondly, I think it operates in the mode of this introspective psychological journey. So all American road movies, by and large, are not really about traveling along a road, right? They are, but they're not. They're exploring some aspect of the American psyche. Yeah, the Easy Rider, Thelma and Louise, I think Nomadland. I haven't seen it, but that's more contemporary. But there's a film came out in 1979 called Apocalypse Now. I don't know if anyone's seen it, about the Vietnam War, and it was Francis Ford Coppola's attempt to travel into the heart of darkness of the American psyche during the American intervention in Vietnam, based on Comrade's Heart of Darkness. And I think Kubrick took this idea that was stretched out over a whole movie, where they travel up a river, where they're traveling inside into Jack's head. So that's why everything, it doesn't matter whether things made sense. There's loads of discussion about the hotel actually structurally doesn't make sense. Rooms are where they shouldn't be, windows are where they shouldn't be. Well, that's because it was built on a set. But ignoring that side, we've got to think, well, why is he allowed that? And I would argue, well, because it's taking that idea of memory as rooms, right? You know, there's this idea, if you want to, one of the ways you can remember lots of stuff is you create rooms in your head, and you can put different things in different rooms. There's probably, Karen probably knows the references better than I do. So I think the hotel, he knows what's in it, possibly because he's been there before. Like, he's a reincarnated ghost. That's one way of looking at it, or a Dybbuk, to use Jewish ideas, or this is about him, i.e. about Jack, and therefore about Kubrick. So this is part of that sort of Freudian introspection and it's coded by that opening shot that's giving you a clue. Actually, this is about something more than just him driving up to a mountain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, brilliant. It makes perfect sense. And yeah, I like how it's kind of weaving together all these references as well. I don't actually know whether Heart of Darkness is still being done on the first year module anymore, the first semester one. It might not, which is a shame, but might be time to reinstate it somewhere else. But I was just thinking, sometimes on this module we do Emily Dickinson's One Need Not Be a Chamber to Be Haunted. So the kind of idea, what you're saying there, rooms as memory, or rooms as kind of parts of the brain. And I suppose I'm kind of preempting my next question. I think you kind of in a way answered it already, that I suppose maybe, yeah, like in this film, the horror really doesn't come from anywhere outside, but it is in Jack, and it is in the character's own kind of psyche, own self. And yeah, so I really like your formulation of the psychological over the supernatural. I was going to just use the opportunity to remind students that they're very, very welcome to post their own questions, because, you know, like we could probably go on very easily until 4, until 5, but do ask your own questions as well if you have any questions for Nathan, because I'm sure there's things about the film that you find interesting and like to ask. Just putting that out there again. But yeah, so I'm going to get to your favorite question, I'm going to assume. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more specifically about your research on Kubrick. So as I mentioned at the start of this lecture/interview, Nathan has recently written a highly acclaimed book called Stanley Kubrick, New York Jewish Intellectual, which makes the case for actually looking at Kubrick's work in a way that fully accounts for the fact that Kubrick had a Jewish background, Jewish identity, but also, I suppose, sometimes a difficult relationship with that background and identity. And so I wonder whether you would mind telling us a little bit more about the significance of Jewishness in The Shining. I'm assuming you won't mind, but
No, not at all. I tend to stay away from that unless I know students want to hear it. Being in Bangor. There was something you said before that I did want to comment on. It just made me think. Is that it was to do with the nature of where the evil is in the hotel, and it's something for you to think about. Is whether Jack's inherently evil, and Thingy suggests that he's not. King suggests he's basically a good man, but you know, he's probably been a victim of abuse and alcoholism. And he's an alcoholic because he's been abused, and hence he becomes an abuser. So that's less obvious in The Shining, but there is that he recounts that sort of time when he abuses Danny, and then there's that creepy conversation with his arm around him, saying, "You know that I love you. You know I wouldn't harm a hair on your head," and Danny knows something's wrong, right? So it's interesting. You know, is the hotel evil? That's what King suggests. And Jack submits to the evilness of the hotel. And this leads me in to answer your question. So at the heart of probably this movie and a lot of Kubrick's work is right, Genesis 22. Now, like, a lot of students are like, well, I don't know anything about the Bible and I'm not religious. And it's like, well, it's irrelevant, right? And it doesn't matter what religion you're from. It's one of the core texts of Western literature, no doubt. And I think probably even more important, probably in the area you teach, Karen, that people have familiarity with it. But one of the key texts of the 20th century, or so much artistic, intellectual, musical, poetic production has been influenced by Genesis 22. So if you don't know, Abraham takes his son, his only son whom he loves, right? I say that on purpose, up a mountain, right? And he prepares him as a sacrifice on the orders of God, right? You know, bear in mind, right? Abraham comes from an idol worshipping culture where gods were represented in figurines, and God was not disembodied and did not speak to you, right? In that sense, you saw God. Whereas Abraham, who's from this culture, suddenly like is hearing a voice from something that isn't out there, he can't see, right? It's quite radical. And that voice says, go take your son up a mountain, prepare him as a sacrifice for me, right? So this is pretty radical. And Abraham lifts that knife. Okay, an angel stays his hand. But as I like to say whenever I'm teaching on this, well, he's as good as kills him. Because you imagine that conversation on the way down with your dad. He's raised a knife to you. Pretty awkward. Or orcs, as they say. And actually, if you read the text closely, Isaac isn't mentioned as coming down the mountain with Abraham, right? So he appears later because he's Abraham's son and the father of Jacob, Jack, who's the progenitor of Israel, of the children of Israel. But some authorities say actually Abraham did kill him, right? Now many people have struggled with this. They're like, this is blind obedience to authority. Okay, how do we grapple with this? Okay, how do we grapple with the troubling implications of Abraham's story? He was willing to kill his only son on the orders of God, but not just but a God he couldn't even see, which is not unlike Jack in The Shining. Jack is willing to correct, to use an euphemism, his son on the orders of an unseen higher power. Okay, so there's lots of similarities in the story, but Freud, Kierkegaard, there's so many paintings across Europe of Genesis 22. Leonard Cohen, The Story of Isaac, Bob Dylan in Highway 61 Revisited. Many others have grappled with this, and I think this is Kubrick's contribution to the genre from his particular perspective. So Freud also Jewish, so it ties in with that. There's Kafka in there. Kubrick was a big fan of Kafka, the Czech Jewish author who reflected on the Jewish condition, but through metaphors. So he rarely actually says any of his protagonists are Jewish, but read Peter the Ape or Gregor Samsa, you could probably translate it better than me, but I know it doesn't translate into English. Some kind of vermin is probably the best word in English, beetle, cockroach. You know, this is an analogy for the Jewish condition, and Kubrick, I think, is doing the same thing through the character of Jack and Danny. They're not explicitly Jewish, but lots of signifiers allow us to read them in that way. But if you can't, it doesn't matter and doesn't change your enjoyment of the film. There's loads of biblical references. Oh, that's great. That's the it's interesting because in Yiddish that gets translated as the Gilgul, and Gilgul means like a revolution, but also means reincarnation, and or metempsychosis, to use another term. Jack certainly undergoes a form of metamorphosis in the movie, and he's driving a Beetle at the beginning of the film, like a Volkswagen Beetle, or a Bug as they call it in the States. And some might say he's reincarnated because he's always been there. So that's another theory. So there's lots of sort of Jewish references thrown in there. I try to argue there's a coherent whole to it. But Kafka influenced his way he adapted it, and I'll give you one example, and he was explicit about this. If you think up to that point in the Gothic, right, everything's dark, especially in the early days. It's black and white, literally. It's chiaroscuro, you know, heavy contrast between light and dark. And you've got the haunted house, the creepy castle. Is it Castle Frankenstein? And you know, Dracula's castle, or the house on the hill. This is a brightly lit hotel, right? All I mean, it's a slightly unusual hotel, but based on real life hotels. But everything's lit up. It's not lit in the everything's lit. Dad trying to speak, middle-aged dad trying to speak like the kids. It's lit. And he said, I'm going to adapt this in the way that Kafka writes. Right, when Kafka writes, he'll stick the unusual in the usual. And so if you've you know, a man who turns into a beetle is treated in the same way as if just someone opened the curtains. And in The Shining, there's no haunted house in that sense, no dark places. I'm rambling here, but so there's loads of Jewishness underpinning in terms of Kafka, and Kafka was fascinated with Genesis 22. Kafka, Freud, the Bible. Think of the names: Jacob that I mentioned earlier. Daniel is the biblical prophet who can interpret dreams, and he reads the writing on the wall, and Danny writes the writing on the wall. So there's loads one can bring to this. So but basically what I was trying to argue in my book is that Kubrick comes from a Jewish background, but the one angle that really hasn't been used in interpreting Kubrick is Jewishness. So I'm not trying to suggest that in any way it's only Jewish. I'm just trying to add another layer of interpretation to say, well, let's think of his films from this way. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying I'm the only one. I'm just saying that this is an approach that you can add to all the other approaches, but none of whom have considered this. And I do it by anchoring it in what Kubrick had to say and what he read and what's in his archive. And we're very interested in, when I say we're hoping to work with someone, what we call in Kubrick's library or Kubrick's bookshelf, where we look at what he read and we can assume what he read, and then we can even look at what he wrote in the books and underlined and what interests him. You can see that with when he goes The Shining, right? In the novel, the boiler blows up, right? So notice that there's a fire at the end, and how does Kubrick end The Shining? Ice, snow, which is actually salt. But that's another thing, because you couldn't have had snow under all those lights; it would have melted. And along the margin of The Shine, Kubrick had written, I won't swear, but it wrote "F the boiler." That was his thoughts on what he wanted to do with that plot device. So yeah, so there's loads there. I mean, going when Jack limps and he drags his foot after Wendy's injured him, that I would argue is a direct allusion to the fact that Jacob limps in the Bible after struggling with the angel, and it's in a sideways tracking shot that lasts quite a long time as it moves across the screen, emphasizing this disability. So I could go on and on. Interestingly, Shelley Duvall was in a Woody Allen movie before that, where she said on film that she had suffered a very Kafkaesque experience, and then she goes into a movie directly influenced by Kafka. So there's loads of little coincidences and otherwise in the movie. But again, none of this is explicit, and it doesn't matter if you spotted it or not. And did Kubrick intend it? I'd like to think so, but I can't prove it. Right, the Kafka I can, because you said that. But I'm trying to advocate for an interpretive approach, right, to add to the many hundreds there have already been.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about how much of it is kind of symbolic and inspired by literature, or then yeah, I think that answer just, if anything, well, on top of many other things, just gives us another way of thinking about adaptation and the kind of many different layers of texts and kind of cultural ideas and narrative come in. So we kind of started with, you know, the horror genre, and now we're kind of like looking, okay, actually the Bible, and so it's a kind of really long yeah, kind of trajectory there of different layers that go into the adaptation, which I mean, I personally find fascinating. So if anyone else would like to talk about anything else, they can ask different questions in the chat. But yeah, sorry.
Can I add something, Karen? It just
Sure.
I forgot the massive major interpretation to answer your last question. If you haven't seen it, I recommend. There's a documentary called Room 237. Okay, there's a copy in the library, and you're allowed to click and collect. So if you Room 237 is a documentary of about 5 different theories about The Shining, and one of them is by a chap called Jeffrey Cox. This is his argument, and it's a Jewish one, is that Jeffrey Cox argues that Kubrick always wanted to make a film about the Holocaust but never did. But the film he ended up making about the Holocaust was The Shining. Now, I think he takes his idea a bit too far, but and having worked with Jeffrey, it's an idée fixe for him. But I think his work getting there was really interesting. And just to give you some background on Kubrick, Kubrick's third wife was not Jewish and German. But it's not the German bit that's of interest. It's that her uncle was a notorious anti-Semitic filmmaker who made probably the most anti-Semitic film ever, called Yud Sus. And he'd married into that family and was fascinated by that background. So you asked me earlier, some call him a self-hater. He did have a complicated relationship with his Jewishness in one sense, but in another sense he didn't, because it was so ingrained in him, it wasn't even worth commenting on. So anyway, drawing that all together, Jeffrey Cox. So I'm just going to shut my door.
Nathan has 2 very, very lovely dogs. But yeah, I suppose for home schooling and lecturing from home, they're not the ideal accompaniments. Or maybe they are. Maybe it's just adds to the flair.
Yeah, it was very Kubrick actually. He had a whole menagerie in his house. Where was I? Yeah, so that whole background of his and his wife's background and his fascination with all things German by his own words, and with the Holocaust, that influenced, Jeffrey Cox argues, his adaptation of The Shining. You know, so there's a book in the library. You can see excerpts online called The Wolf at the Door. You know, it's a controversial thesis, but that's what Jeffrey Cox argues. I don't 100% agree with him, but I kind of have to add that in if we're talking about Kubrick and Jewishness and interpretation.
Yeah, I suppose it's that. I suppose where your answer is kind of very open and looks at the kind of resonances, it becomes a much more narrow reading of the film, I guess, but very, very interesting to look into nonetheless. And I think Room 237 might be on Amazon Prime, or it might be relatively cheap to rent on there, if click and collect is proving challenging, if you're not in Bangor. I think we've got time for sort of one-ish question, depending on the answer. So I think I'm going to go back to doubles and mirrors, if that's okay, because I think you mentioned the idea of doubling a little bit before. So it's something we've been grappling with on this module from the start, really, the idea of doubling, particularly because we also looked at the uncanny, and then I suppose related to doubling and mirror images. And you can pick what you want to talk about of the two, or whether you want to talk about both. But yeah, we looked at the kind of silent film adaptation of Frankenstein, the really early one, and looking in the mirror, and the creature looking in the mirror in the early Frankensteins. And so, but either one of those, doubles or mirrors, or both, for the last few minutes of the session.
Okay, I have to get in again. So Mary Shelley was directly influenced by the myth of the Golem. I don't know if you discussed this, but that's why I'm interested in at the moment, is Kubrick and the Golem, and how much that influenced him. And so in there's probably that element of recognition of being alive, that Lacanian mirror moment, I imagine. So doublings. In this one, the interesting doublings, right? Animals are gonna just got to open the door to let them in there. There we go. Here they are. There might be some barking. So yeah, the doublings here come in the fact that the lead actor's called Jack. The character's called Jack. Danny Lloyd plays Danny Torrance. Jack drinks Jack Daniels. Jack Kubrick's father's called Jack. Right. So Kubrick and Jack Nicholson are doubles for each other. So I think for me the doubling here comes also in a sense of Freudian introspection. The mirrors I'd love to talk more about. I haven't done too much into it, but what I'm interested in is all the shining takes place when they're in front of mirrors. So I think there's this age-old idea of mirrors as divination devices that in the old days. So there's when Jack's shining in the gold room, he's sitting in front of the bar at a mirror, and then he goes into the toilet, and he's shining again because he imagines Delbert Grady in front of all those mirrors. I mean, he's probably just talking to himself, right? We could go on like that. So for me, and I need to do more on that. Is mirrors are about divination. You know, in the old days when you consulted a prophet, a seer, they had, you know, they might read entrails or whatnot. Mirrors was one of the ways to do it. So that's how I sort of read that, which probably isn't Gothic. It's probably more biblical. But you know,
the two
as I
are
said,
close to each other, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as I said, I haven't. Those are just thoughts, and I need to, or someone needs to explore them further.
Well, this is brilliant. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I'm assuming that everyone has found it useful, so I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the whole group very much for giving up time to talk to us about The Shining, for giving us a bit more to think about, and yeah, I'm sure the rest of the group would also like to join me. I mean, I'll ask everyone to turn their cameras on and applaud, but I know that's not going to happen. So you're just going to have to imagine it, like on the radio. You're just going to have to imagine the waves of enthusiasm from our listeners at home. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and for agreeing to do it this way.
I think it worked well. It was enjoyable as well, and yeah, I'll put the recording up, and obviously as agreed, I share it with you as well. And yeah, thank you very much, Nathan.
You're welcome.
Thanks everyone for listening. Yeah, we've got lots of people. Sorry.
Hopefully see some of you on my module in the future.
Yes, do you remember that Nathan has a full Stanley Kubrick module which will be open to English literature students in the future, so you absolutely have that option, and we've got lots of messages of thanks in the chat as well. People found it very interesting and useful, so brilliant. Well, I'll let everyone go, and I have to do my next 2 hours of teaching, so much appreciated. Thank you.
That's all right, you're welcome. Okay, bye everyone.